Okay. Thank you all for joining. Today's date is October 17, 2021, and we have an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation simulation with DAOUD KUTTAB. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation proposes a common government for the people of Israel and Palestine based on secular democratic principles with separation between religion and government. What we are proposing is a common government separate from the Israeli and separate from the Palestinian government, independent of the government of Israel and the Palestinian government. A government for the entire area of Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, which is 14 million people. We are not proposing the dismantling of the Israeli government or the Palestinian government. We are proposing a common government based on equality that will have a separate legislative body, a separate judicial body, and a separate executive body or branches. So it would be a legislative branch, a parliament, a executive branch, president and vice president, and judges, all equal to Israelis and Palestinians together, based on a democratic principle and based on a constitution. My name is Joseph Avasar, and this is my email, josephavassar@gmail.com. This is our website. If you go to our website, it's in 3 languages: Arabic, Hebrew, and English. You can go to our Constitution and read the entire Constitution of how a common government will function, what would be its principles as a democratic government for the people of Israel and Palestine based on equality, and how it will function alongside with the Israeli and the Palestinian government. It's a long constitution. I'm not going to read it now, but later on I will have the important part of it so that we can do the simulation. You can also go to the frequently asked questions and understand how this common government will function based on questions and answers that are commonly given to us and we respond to. Today, we have our guest speaker, DAOUD KUTTAB. DAOUD KUTTAB is a Palestinian journalist from Jerusalem who emigrated to the US with his family when he was 14 years old. After studying in the US, he returned to his homeland, where he became an award-winning journalist and television producer. He is a former Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University, a columnist for Al Monitor, and a reporter for Arab News. He established the Institute of Modern Media at Al-Quds University and was the first Palestinian to interview an Israeli prime minister for the leading Al-Quds Daily in June 1993. He writes regularly in major publications such as the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Jordan Times, and often contributes to Projects Syndicate. I may add that I also saw his op-ed in the LA Times. He established the Arab world's first internet Radio Amman Net and is the founder of and director of Community Media Network in Amman, Jordan. As a leading activist for press freedom in the Arab world, he was the first Arab to be elected to the Vienna-based International Press Institute, where he holds the portfolio of press freedom. Mr. KUTTAB has 4 children and 3 grandchildren. He lives between Jerusalem and Amman, Jordan. I just asked him where he is, and he said that he is in Jordan right now. We ask many people to become speakers. We do not select people based on their one point of view or another. We're inviting different people with different points of view to speak. Our next speaker will be on November 2nd, will be Avram Borg, who is the former Knesset speaker for the Israeli parliament. We will have Noam Chomsky again for the second time on November 14th. We will have Dr. James Zogby, who does the famous Zogby polling on Tuesday, November 30th. Note that it will be Tuesday, not a Sunday. We will have Knesset member Ofer Kasif on December 19th. And we will have Richard A. Falk on December 27th. He's an international lawyer. We will have Gadi Baltiansky. He's the prior press secretary for Prime Minister Ehud Barak on January 9, 2022. We will have Professor Galia Golan, who is a political science professor in Israel, Jerusalem, on January 23rd, 2022. And we will have Professor Shibli Telhami in March, but we will have other people between February and March, between January and March. So Professor Shibli Telhami on March 20th, 2022. We estimate that the simulation today will take 2 hours, and it will be several segments. So we will present the Constitution, we will present legislation, and each segment will be followed by comments from our speaker. And then we will have question and answer with our speaker, Mr. KUTTAB. And then we'll have closing remarks. Mr. KUTTAB, is this acceptable to you, this
Yes.
format? Thank you.
Sounds good.
Thank you. We have a 2.5-minute video that explains what the simulation is, and bear with me, but it's very informative.
The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has endured for generations, and instead of time healing the wounds, it's only caused the anger to fester and the violence to grow. But what if there was a way to alleviate the tension? Something that may not outright solve every problem, but at least create a forum that encourages a peaceful compromise. Welcome to the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, a common third government between the Israeli and Palestinian citizens, specifically designed to foster peace, tolerance, and economic prosperity between the two nations. Here's how it works. First off, both Israel and Palestine will keep their respective governments. Israel's Knesset and the Palestinian National Authority will remain unchanged. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, IPC, will be a third entity acting as a unifying agent between the two. The IPC will comprise 300 parliament members elected from 300 districts in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Above them will preside a president and vice president, one Israeli and one Palestinian. In order for the IPC to pass a law, it will require a 55% majority from its Israeli representatives, as well as a 55% majority from its Palestinian representatives, thereby preventing either side from monopolizing the legislature. Of course, the IPC won't undermine the political power of either the Israeli or the Palestinian government. At any time, Israel or Palestine may veto a law passed by the IPC. If neither side vetoes, the law is passed. and the two nations are another step closer to resolution. Please help us make this a reality. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. We might speak different languages, but we all mean the same thing.
So the purpose of the simulation is to demonstrate how a common government could make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but not only between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but also with the entire, its neighbors, the neighbors of Israel and Palestine. We're not here to have a historical review of the conflict. We're not here to blame one side over another. We're not anti-Israel and we're not anti-Palestinian. We are pro-peace. Mr. KUTTAB is our speaker today. He is not a representative of the IPC. He was invited as part of our stress test. We are conducting a stress test to this formula. We are asking different people with different point of view to stress test this formula, to tell us if they see anything wrong with it or anything positive with it. We are pro-peace. We have our own narrative. We do not have the Israeli narrative or the Palestinian narrative. We anticipate that when this government is created, it will have its own narrative, not an Israeli narrative, not a Palestinian narrative, but a global narrative, its own narrative. We expect to have a rigorous discussion, but we are asking you to be very respectful of our speaker, of each other, so that it's clear. We do not preclude other formulas. We think our formula is better than others, but we do not preclude other formulas. We encourage other formulas, and we encourage the competition between other formulas and our formula. We had some disruptions in the past, but it hasn't happened in a long time. We don't anticipate it to happen again. The criteria for judging our plan, we will ask Mr. KUTTAB, is this: could the IPC formula attain peace? Is the IPC plan implementable? Is there a downside for either the Israelis or the Palestinians? This is what we ask not only the speaker, but all of you to judge this formula based on these criteria. We are going to be proposing legislation and a constitution. It's important that you understand we are not the government. This is only for purposes of demonstration only. What we are showing, we believe, is the tip of the iceberg. A common government could do a lot more than what we are able to show you in the 2 hours today. We're asking you to look at the big picture, avoid technical arguments. Also, we're asking you to refrain from comments during the simulation, but questions are okay. In fact, they are encouraged. What is the difference between a question and a comment? If I show you a picture of an airplane and you say, Joseph, how does this thing fly? That's a question. But if you say, Joseph, I will never board an airplane because airplanes pollute the air and airplanes are dangerous, that's a comment. I would ask that you would refrain from commenting until the end, but you are welcome and encouraged to ask questions. There are certain facts and assumptions that you'll have to make during the simulation. This is a simulation, so, and let me try to get to my pen. Okay, so these facts we believe you will all agree with. That the Israeli Prime Minister represents Israelis only, because he's elected by Israelis. That the Palestinian leaders represent Palestinians only. But we're asking you, for the purpose of this simulation, to assume certain facts. So these are not real facts, but we're asking you to assume them. So the first assumption that we're asking you to accept as fact is that we held an online election for the last 3 months. that the 14 million people in Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem were allowed to vote. And in fact, 5 million people did vote. So that's an important assumption, that 5 million people did vote. That 3 million Palestinians voted and 2 million Israelis voted. I also want you to assume, for purposes of this simulation, that I, Joseph, was elected as president. I received 1.5 million votes. That a Palestinian lady received 1.3 million votes. And we will rotate. I become president first for 2 years. She become president second, and I will become vice president in 2 years. I also want you to assume that 300 parliament members were elected in Gaza, Israel, the West Bank, and Jerusalem. That each parliament member represents 47,000 people in this area. So are there any questions about those assumptions? Do any of you have any questions? I can bring it back to the screen. Are any questions about those assumptions? Are they not clear? Because what we have to do is we will have to act in this simulation based on those assumptions. So I hear no questions, and you can ask them later if you want. Is Mr. KUTTAB, are you willing to accept those assumptions for the purposes of this simulation?
Yeah, I'm happy to assume, to accept the assumptions, but I'm not sure I understand the issue of the sovereignty. Are we talking about two independent states that would do these elections and would have control over their land or not?
We are the government of the entire area, 14 million people. We elected 300 parliament members in Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. The Israeli government represents their government, their people. The Palestinian government represents their people. We are not getting involved into the land issue, the border issues between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We are saying we are the legitimate government of the entire area, and we recognize the sovereignty of the two governments. Now, you may ask me, what does sovereignty means in this context? What it means, and you'll see later on, it comes up in the Constitution, is that if we need to implement legislation, and we cannot do it without the cooperation of either the Palestinian government or the Israeli government, then we are encroaching on their sovereignty, and we're giving them a veto power because we have no choice. So we're giving them a veto power over our legislation. So you'll see how it works.
Joseph, Joseph, this is Amnon. I have a question to you personally. Are you placing the cart before the horse? Isn't it better to have the Confederation after we have the two states? What do you think?
Well, the Israelis and the Palestinian governments are entitled to negotiate two states at any time. But we do not believe that we have to wait for them to put the horse before the cart, so to speak. And we don't really accept that notion that two-state is the necessary first step. We think peace is the necessary first step, but according to the Constitution, we are not interfering. So let me go to the Constitution, but before that, we need to have, I'm going to ask all the participants. First of all, I need volunteers in order to demonstrate how it works, I need someone to act as Israeli Prime Minister.
I can do it. It's Amnon. I can do it.
Okay, terrific. I need someone to be a Palestinian Authority leader. Do we have someone volunteering to be Palestinian Authority leader.
I could do it if there's nobody. I could do it again. Nasir.
Okay, who is this?
Nasir.
Okay, Nasir. Do I have someone to be Hamas leader? I need a Hamas leader.
Can be
Who is that?
Hazem.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
Hazem.
Hazem. Okay, terrific.
Hazem.
Okay, terrific. So we have, okay. The rest of you will have to choose. You will have to act. You are acting as if you are a parliament member, either Israeli or Palestinian. So you'll have to choose in your own mind whether you're Israeli or Palestinian parliament member. And you'll have to decide what is your district. Are you a Palestinian from Gaza, or are you Israeli from Tel Aviv, or are you in a mixed district? You could be a Palestinian who was elected by Israelis, or a Israeli elected by Palestinians in a mixed district. But I'm not asking you to tell us, but you'll decide in your own mind where you are. And we're going to test the votes right now. So let's have the Palestinian parliament members vote first. Please vote. Okay, so we see how many we have. Okay, so we have okay, let's give you one. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling. We have 14 Palestinian parliament members. And let's have the Israeli parliament member vote. This is just to test. Okay, so we have 9 Israeli parliament members. Terrific. So we tested, and you remain as either Palestinian or Israeli throughout this simulation. So now we have the Israeli. Let's stop sharing. Oh, let's share the result. I'm sorry. And let's stop sharing after we, Dan, can you share the results? Okay, so we have 9 Israeli, 14 Palestinian, and you remain in this simulation at either Israeli or Palestinian. And remember that you only represent your district. I was elected as the president of the whole area. You only represent a district. You represent your district. You don't represent the, and you will have to decide on how you vote based on what's good for your district, whether your district is Israeli or Palestinian or a mixed district. You'll have to, and I expect honest voting from you based on what's good for your district. So your first question is not how you yourself think, but how you as a parliament member who was elected, who ran for to be elected, how you think is best for your district. That's how you should decide. That's how you should vote in this simulation.
I didn't know that I should vote. Should I vote? And I just realized that I should have voted. I didn't vote.
Okay, are you Israeli? I'll add you. Are you Israeli or Palestinian?
I'm Palestinian.
Okay, so we have Palestinian, 15 Palestinian. Okay. Wait, we're gonna have some, yeah. Okay, so that's okay. So, so the first order of business is to ratify the Constitution. Now, remember, you all ran for parliament. You're aware of this Constitution. So let's ratify the Constitution. We believe that Palestinians and Israelis are entitled to equal rights under the law and guaranteed human rights and freedom. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation does not intend to supersede or supplant the Palestinian or Israeli government, nor to abrogate or undermine any agreements between those governments. So that means we are not here to undermine those governments But more importantly, we are also not here to abrogate or undermine any agreements between those two governments. So the Israeli government and the Palestinian government, they can agree to whatever they want. We do not have jurisdiction, and our constitution prohibits us from undermining any agreements between them. We do not working against their agreement. They can agree to whatever they want. We recognize the need to work with the Israeli and Palestinian governments. Our purpose is to resolve conflicts and to expand the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis in a fair and equitable manner. We believe in equal rights under the law, guaranteed human rights, and freedom for all. We voluntarily give the legislators and the government of Israel and Palestine veto power over legislation we pass relating to the sovereignty of those nations. So that's critical. We're basically saying in the Constitution, if the legislation we pass impinges on the sovereignty of the Israeli or the Palestinian government, we give them a veto power over it. So that means we have to pass reasonable legislation that would be acceptable to both sides. If it's not acceptable to one side, then they can veto it. We believe in the separation of power between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. We believe in the creation of a permanent secular government for all the people residing in Israel and Palestine. We believe in having separate judicial branch relating to the IPC legislation with Israeli and Palestinian judges, with a system to avoid biased decision based on nationality. So does anyone have any questions before we vote? So first we'll have questions, then we'll vote, and then we'll have Mr. KUTTAB give us his opinion regarding the Constitution. Okay, Janine, can you ask a question? Yeah, I see you raise your hand, Janine.
I'm unmuting. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, so this is a question for Mr. DAOUD KUTTAB, please. So,
Wait. Questions about the Constitution, not to Mr. KUTTAB. He hasn't
oh,
spoken.
I'm sorry. No. I will wait.
Sorry. Send it
Does
to your
anyone
email.
have any questions regarding the Constitution that was just read to you?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Is it really like reasonable to believe that we can separate between the church and the state in the Middle East? When you say like we're going to have a secular state.
Well, it's a secular government. So I understand what you're saying. The Israeli government, they include religion in their government. And the Palestinian government, I think Hamas especially, they include religion. But this is a common government. It's not Israeli, it's not Palestinian, it's for both. So for that purpose, I think it makes it easier to conceptualize separating between religion and government because it's a common government. So if we make that government Jewish, it's not fair to the Muslim and to the Christians. If we make it Muslim or Christian, it's not fair to the and it's not good for democracy. So I think it is possible to have a secular third government, common government for both. Yes. Any other questions?
It would be one of a kind in the region.
Yes, it would be, and there's nothing wrong with progress.
I have a question.
Yeah, come on.
I just wanted to ask, could you explain how this government would gain legitimacy? And how do you think whether Israel would accept such a situation? Israel has such a powerful hold on the whole area, the whole region. Why would Israel even allow this to happen?
Okay, so the underlying assumption that you're making is that Israel will not allow that to happen. And you may be right. It's a possible assumption, but you may be right. But you have to remember, Israel has never been able to give peace to its people. So here comes a new formula that of a common government that actually had the votes of 5 million people. So Israel and the Palestinians also, they always said that they will turn every rock to make peace. So here they have their own people, Israelis and Palestinians, voting for an alternative, and it is not a threat to the Israeli people or the Palestinian people. So just by process of democratic principle, Israel will not be able to object. Now, not only would it not have the legitimacy to object, it doesn't have the legal ability. There is no law that prevents the Israelis and the Palestinians from creating a common government. Plus, if you remember, this election took place online. So Israel would not have the technological ability to prevent such an election. So it's not a matter of whether they will allow it or not. They just don't have the ability, even if they want to. But I'm not sure they want to, or the Palestinian would want to. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question, Joseph, quickly.
Yes.
The last stipulation in the Constitution, we believe in having separate judicial branch relating the IPC legislation with Israeli Palestinian judges with a system to avoid biased decision based on nationality. Considering the fact that Israel doesn't recognize Palestinian as a nationality, would it be better to phrase that decisions based on national identity? Because then that says that however a person identifies as their with their statehood, whether or not the state exists. So avoiding biased decisions based on national identity.
Okay, I really don't see the difference, but let me just explain what this paragraph means. It means that in order to decide against a Palestinian, there'll have to be majority Palestinian judges. So, so Israelis could not decide against a Palestinian. It would have to be majority Palestinian judges. In order to decide against an Israeli, you will need majority Israeli judges. So that's what it really means. And the judges would identify themselves as either Israelis or Palestinians. Okay, more questions I see. Just because I have this in front of me, so if you can just holler the question.
I have a question.
Yeah, hi, Lillian, yes.
I'm a Palestinian.
Yes, hi.
What about human rights, the rights of the Palestinians? I mean, you can't move into, I love the idea you have. I love what you're planning to do, but my concern is about the people who lost their homes and lost everything, lost family members. Mainly, what about their compensation or letting them go back to their own homes?
Okay, so we are a separate government. We're not Israeli, we're not Palestinian, we're Israeli-Palestinian. Our Constitution says we believe in equal rights under the law, guaranteed human rights, and freedom for all. This is part of our Constitution. The Parliament will pass legislation later on to deal with specific issues, such as the right of return, the refugees, Jerusalem, etc. But this is only the Constitution that says we are all equal. We didn't even get to specific legislation. Any other questions?
My other concern is, for instance, I have grandchildren who are Danish, some are American. So will they be able to come back?
Well, that's part of the legislation that will have to pass, whether they will be able to come or not. That's not up to me. It's up to the 300 parliament members. We have legislation on that aspect, and I can present it to you, but it would have to be 55% of the Israelis parliament members and 55% of the Palestinian parliament members, and then it will be subjected to a veto by the Israeli and the Palestinian government. So to answer your question, my feeling is that the Israelis will veto it, but it really depends how it would come out. Any other questions? Okay, so I hear no other questions. I am going to take this to a vote.
All right.
I'm
sorry, I had a question.
Yeah, Jack.
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty. The only real concern I have with this, and it's an odd one to have, because in general, I strongly believe in secular government, but considering that the Jewish people are surrounded by religious.
What is your question?
Well, is it fair to ask the Jewish people to maintain a secular state when they're surrounded by states that are not? In the region, they're pretty much the only democracy and then the only Jewish state, and they're surrounded by theocratic states. So I think we're inclined to do it, but it seems a little unfair to ask in light of the
okay, this constitution does not interfere in any shape or form with the Israeli government and the way it wants to define itself. It only is a mechanism to make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It does not affect a Jewish state or a Palestinian state or Palestinian aspiration. This is a common government for the people of Israel and Palestine who say, we want to find ways to make peace. And I don't think that you're trying to say that a Jewish government or a Jewish state has to be in a constant war with the Palestinians.
I would hope not. And perhaps I misinterpreted. The overarching government would be secular, but the individual states would retain if they chose.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, so let's have the Palestinian vote. Oh, they already voted. Okay, I think we have 15 Palestinian. Okay, we have 17 actually. That's even better. 19. Okay, 19, 20, 21. Okay, so let's end the polling. 100% of the Palestinian parliament members voted in favor of this constitution. Let's have the Israeli parliament members vote on this constitution. Okay, hurry up and vote. Sorry we have a lot of business to do, so. Okay, so let's end the polling and share the results. 100% of the Israeli parliament members voted in favor of this constitution. So congratulations, we have the first constitution in the history of humanity for the people of Israel and Palestine, for a democratic government in Israel and Palestine. And now we are going to turn it to Mr. DAOUD KUTTAB to give us his opinion regarding this momentous occasion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I thank you for your persistence. You know, you've been asking me to come on for about 2 years maybe, or something like that. And I've resisted. So I congratulate you for your persistence. So I'm very happy to be here. I think it's a clearly well thought out program, even more than I expected, to be honest. And I have shunned this idea because I've always thought, and I still think, that before we get to the potentially one state solution, we need to finalize the end of the occupation. So the idea of what we term as the one state solution has always been a theoretical idea. And this idea is yours is also, or this team's is still a theoretical idea, but at least it's clear that you thought through many of the obstacles that would make things difficult. So I congratulate you for that. As far as this particular piece of legislation is concerned, I think you normally need what is called the definitions, and we don't really have definitions here. So we don't know what defines an Israeli and what defines a Palestinian. Is a Palestinian Arab in Nazareth an Israeli, or is he a Palestinian? Is a Jewish settler in Hebron a Palestinian or an Israeli? So this issue, I think, needs to be set aside. We also need to know if the idea of equality, in other words, having the parliament split in half or 50-50, is something that is eternal, or is it something that should reflect the population? How do we deal with the fact that right now it might be actually quite close to equality, or even maybe there's more Palestinian Arabs in between the river and the sea? But the question that comes up is, do we keep the 50-50 no matter what the populations are, or do we need to have every 10 years a census and then revisit that issue? So these are issues that I think can affect whether we will have a minority population having equal rights with the majority population. So these are some of the questions in terms of definitions that I felt did not were not addressed properly, and I would like to see how one addressed them. Obviously, the big problem that a constitution like this have, with all the caveats that you've properly placed, that basically you removed all the different potential points of trouble, is that you basically have a constitution that really will not go anywhere. The laws will not be passed, and the past laws will not be agreed to, and so it's a law of paralysis. And furthermore, there is no what is the incentive to make it work? I mean, does this government have a police? Does it have the enforcement ability to execute or to deliver on decisions that pass by 55% of both sides and were not vetoed? What happens when you start trying to implement them, the people don't agree and don't accept and will not allow. And the local governments, even though they didn't veto it because the Americans put pressure or the Saudis put pressure on the Palestinians, but then when you come down to removing a settler, or you're moving a Palestinian or whatever, all of a sudden you'll find that there is a problem in the execution. So a constitution and a government in anywhere in the world needs to have teeth, and without teeth, it will not be able to carry out its process. I mean, as I said, I think by doing these simulations, you clearly have gone way overboard in a nice way to avoid every single problem. But as a result, basically, it requires a very high level of acceptance by both sides, a high level of removal of the veto power by both sides. And as a result, I'm wondering what would be the incentive for the members of parliament to ratify resolutions of 55% and ensure that there will not be a veto. So it's a very high bar that you've set. And I understand why you said it, because you wanted to succeed. But as a result, you've created an extremely high bar that will basically result in a parliament that doesn't really make decisions and is not able to make decisions because they cannot convince each other if there was a way to entice the legislators, if they have a huge budget that if they don't pass and the people will not get it and so on, so you start making compromises. But I don't see why the Palestinians would accept something that is against their desire and that their government will veto, or vice versa. So I would like to know how we can go from a very nice theoretical academic exercise to something that is realistic. Maybe later on in when we start looking at the laws, this could come through, but I still feel that we are missing the power that normally governments and parliaments have, that that okay, we don't like this, but we need the money for my state, so I'll make a compromise on this issue if you make a compromise on that issue, and then we will get the money in and blah blah blah. So if the government, for example, can take let's say federal tax, and the federal tax is given to the parliament, and the parliament can distribute the tax based on agreement, then okay, maybe then there's something to work on. So these are the things that I don't know how they will work. So just the idea of passing a law without having the power and the money and the teeth that a government needs would be nothing more than a nice, a very beautiful exercise. But I think that's where we need to find more material to make the exercise work.
Let me just respond preliminarily to your comment about who is Palestinian and who is Israeli. When it comes to voting, it makes no difference, because a Palestinian can vote for Israeli and Israeli can vote for a Palestinian. The only difference is when it comes to the candidates themselves. The candidates will have to declare themselves either Israeli or Palestinian when they run. And it would be up to the voters to decide whether they are Palestinians or Israelis, whether they are not really Palestinians or not really Israelis. So it's more limited. But let me go to the question that you raised about the veto power, because that's a question that most comes up. And let me start with the easy part, and that's, so you're asking why would they not veto it? So I'm going to start with the easy and go to the more complex issues. Okay, so remember, we have a common government, 300 parliament members. I am the president, and we are now dealing with this. I'm not sure. Do you see this? Do you see the teaching of tolerance?
We just see you, that's all.
You're not sharing your screen.
Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. Okay, so let me share my screen. I apologize. So let me share my screen. That's what happens when I go back and forth. I will deal with it. Okay, here it is. Let me share my screen. And let me get to the legislation. Okay, so here we are. Do you see it now? Do you see my screen? Yes, you see it. Okay, and let me deal with this legislation. Passed the Constitution, and now we're dealing with this legislation. Teaching tolerance and understanding. So I introduced this legislation as the president, and this is the legislation. both educational systems to teach tolerance in their public schools. Devote a certain number of hours for both sides to teach the history of the Israelis and the Palestinians, as well as teaching Arabic and Hebrew. Create a mutual task force. By the way, this is Nassim's idea. To ensure the teaching. Nasir, I'm sorry. To teach, creating a mutual task force to ensure the teaching of both languages. Educators to draft textbooks together and arrange for a regular exchange of teachers. Public media on both sides to provide fair and equal coverage daily for teaching tolerance. IPC, Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, us, will be the facilitator to ensure that both sides are fairly represented. So I am presenting this now to the common government, to the common parliament. Are there any questions regarding this legislation before we vote? And before we submit it to the Israeli and the Palestinian and the Hamas leader? Any questions? Okay, I hear no questions.
I think Esther Robbins, she's raising her finger.
Yeah, I actually wrote it down. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Can the common government agree on a 1 or 2 state solution? Or
Yes.
can they impose it?
No, they cannot impose because there is a veto power given to the Israeli and the Palestinian government. But they can vote on any other formula for peace, including 2 states or 1 state. And once they vote, they submit it to the Israeli government and the Palestinian governments, including their parliament, for a veto. So yes, they can decide on anything they want, but it will be subject to a veto. Any questions regarding this legislation? Teaching tolerance and understanding. So let's have the Palestinian parliament members vote. Palestinian parliament members only. We need 55% of you to approve this legislation. Okay. Let's end the polling. Share the result. 100% of the Palestinian parliament members voted in favor of this legislation. Let's go to the Israeli parliament members. Only, please vote. We need 55% of you to vote to approve this legislation. Okay. Let's end the polling. Share the results. 100% of the Israeli parliament members voted. So let's stop sharing and let's go to the Hamas leader. Mr. Hamas leader, are you going to veto this legislation?
No.
Let's go to the Israeli Prime Minister. Mr. Prime Minister, are you going to veto this legislation?
This legislation promotes understanding and acceptance of each side, so I will definitely not veto that.
Okay. And because you always said that you will turn every stone, every rock for peace, correct?
That's correct.
And the same for Hamas leader. You always said that you will do whatever you can for peace, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and let's go to the PA, Nasir.
Yes, I will also support and not veto this measure in agreement, yes.
Okay, so this measure is now the law of the land. And let's go to Mr. KUTTAB and ask you to opine. Once you saw that there is a possibility that all sides will agree to a legislation and neither side will vote. Mr. KUTTAB, could you tell us your opinion regarding this legislation?
Well, again, it's very nice, beautifully written, and the idea of tolerance and acceptance is quite welcomed, and we saw the 100% vote on both sides. So there's clearly public support for the idea. The problem is, again, when you come to the nuts and bolts, how do we do it? How do we decide? I mean, you talk about Israelis exchanging with the Palestinians. Most Israeli teachers don't know Arabic. Many Palestinian teachers know Hebrew a little bit more than the other way around. So we will need to put a lot more effort in getting the teachers to know each other's language, which is, you know, it's good. It's a very positive and honorable thing to do. And then we have the problem of the interpretation. We've seen many places where the curriculum is grandiose and excellent, but then teachers kind of put the curriculum aside and give their personal opinions, which sometimes contradict the curriculum. So we need, you know, again, we don't want to put a policeman in every classroom, but we need to find ways to ensure that the teachers do not shy away from the accepted, agreed to curriculum if we do reach that. Again, you know, in theory, people will all agree to these issues, but when it comes to the practice, they will hesitate in doing it. The money will be not coming through. The classroom teaching is going to be quite different from the reality, especially when you're talking about issues. You know, in South Africa, they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I'm not sure we can skip that type of issue, truth and reconciliation, to jump right into teaching tolerance and everybody's happy and everybody's, you know, singing Kumbaya and we all love each other and so on. It's beautiful, it's nice, but the reality, again, if I can explain or give an example of my own personal experience, in right after the Oslo Accords, I was the executive producer of the Palestinian version of Sesame Street. And I worked with the people in New York to produce the Palestinian version of Sesame Street, and then our Israeli friends from Israel Education Television were producing the Israeli version, and then we had some scenes that were together, and the you know, the educators from Columbia University and others did the before and after research, and after they were done, they were a bit surprised, and we had a big workshop for days, and they said, you know, the Israeli attitudes to Palestinians changed, but the Palestinian attitudes to Israel didn't change, or changed very little. And can you explain that? And I said, for sure, I can explain that. In Israel, Palestinians were, you know, are far away. And once they saw a Palestinian Muppet play with the Israeli Muppet and things like that, of course, that changed their attitude. But for the Palestinians, what they saw on television, they opened the door and there was an Israeli tank outside their house. And when they went to school, the Israeli soldiers screamed at their parents. And so no matter what you did on television, and again, no matter what we will do in the teaching in class, if we cannot, if the reality is deformed, whatever we do in teaching is not going to do much. So I do support the concept, but as I said then, and I would say now, these are the things that we need to start the day after there is genuine peace between both sides. Until there's an end to occupation, these are great ideas, will work on the day after peace, but they are not a replacement of the need for a negotiated settlement. So this is my concern, is that yes, we can talk about it, and it's a beautiful you know, piece of legislation, and both sides have voted 100%, and we are not going to veto it and everything. But the reality, the gap between this and the reality is my worry.
Okay, so yeah, you mentioned the reality, and that brings us to the next. And you also mentioned, are they going to have a police force? So yes, so this is the legislation regarding a police force. Equal number of Israelis and Palestinians on each level. Remember, this is a third government. It's not Israeli, not Palestinian. It's a common government. Equal number of Israelis and Palestinians on each level. Different and distinct uniform. So it will have its own uniform. independent of the Israeli and the Palestinian security forces, in cooperation with the separate Israeli and Palestinian authorities, but independent and separate from them. Address sensitive religious, cultural, languages requirements. Facilitate the operation of the joint economic zone. We'll bring you legislation regarding joint economic zone. Investigate corruption by administrator who refused to teach tolerance. Investigate allegations of intolerance and racist hate crimes against Israelis or Palestinians. Assist in managing checkpoints, guard the parliament building and threats against members of the Confederation, and facilitate access to and safety of religious facilities. Does anyone have any questions regarding this legislation?
Yes, I do. Thanks.
Avi?
Yeah, yes. Thanks, first of all. I mean, every time that you present it, it's always it's more fluent and one understand it better and better. I mean, you collect also your own experience with that.
Yeah. Right.
Now to the joint Israeli part, I think it's the first time that I see this kind of about the police force. I can't really imagine, because till now I understood it more as a realistic but a virtual government, which means they don't have a place where they sit. So where do you want to place this kind of a joint police force? You mean on the borders at the economic zone or something like that?
Well, whatever they decide to have their buildings or their headquarters and many buildings, it would be in cooperation with
like the FBI and the local police.
I'm sorry?
Like the FBI is the federal ruler and the local police.
Yes. Yes. Any other questions? Yeah, you're absolutely right. The FBI has offices in Los Angeles, in Seattle, in New York, everywhere. Okay, any other questions? You're raising your hand, but I don't see who you are. So I apologize.
Sorry, Joseph, I was raising my hand. My name is Olivia. Sorry.
Yes, hi.
Oh, hi. Can I ask the question?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. I have to try to read it first on a bigger screen. Hang on. It's about corruption, investigating, right? Investigate corruption by administrators who, no, blah, blah, blah. No, hang on. No, it's another one. Investigate allegations. Hang on. Oh, I thought it was just investigating corruption. Sorry, I misread.
Okay, let me see where you are referring to.
No, it was too small. And
corruption. You hear?
Yeah, I thought it was investigating corruption, because I wonder if somebody is at fault, what's the next step? The next step is something like a fine or a punishment, and that leads us on to the judiciary. So there, what I misunderstood, I thought it was investigating corruption of funds, etc., etc. So now I see it's investigating corruption by administrators who refuse to teach tolerance.
Correct.
Right. If anyone's not doing what they're meant to do, well, then what's the next step in the way of a sanction or a fine or punishment? Well, what is it? And who enforces it?
So, for example, let's say a Palestinian professor comes to Israel and he wants to teach Palestinian history. And the principal in the school says, oh, we are not allowing you to come in, even though this legislation passed to teach tolerance. But he on his own decides that the Palestinian professor is not allowed to come to his school. He's in violation of the law that his government agreed to, and the common police force will investigate and possibly arrest him if necessary, and put him on trial, because that's the law of the land. Any other
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Joseph, I have a question to Mr. KUTTAB, if I may, please. Mr. KUTTAB, salam alaikum.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Shukran. Regarding all these legislations, do you think that Hamas will take any actual steps to interfere or to prevent people from running to this parliament or for voting for the IPC? What is your opinion on Hamas reaction?
Maybe we should ask the Hamas representative here.
Yeah, but we're only acting here. But you, as a Palestinian, you
yeah, but I yield to the Hamas representative, and then I'm answering it.
Is it because it's a difficult question to answer?
No, it's not difficult. But I prefer that because the rules of the game is that there is somebody representing Hamas. So as a person who agreed to the rules, I think we need to give their point of view, and then I will answer. I'm not afraid of answering.
Okay, so let's ask the Hamas leader. Are you going to prevent people from running, or are you going to prevent people from voting, or you try to prevent?
Can you repeat the question, please, again?
Yeah, the question is, do you think that the Hamas will interfere or will take any actual steps to prevent people from running to this parliament or voting for the IPC?
I mean, you can assume that that Hamas will prevent many issues or object to many issues. However, if Hamas would agree to the game from the beginning, then it might go smoother than expected.
Okay,
Okay,
so
let's take a vote on this.
So now, Mr. KUTTAB, maybe you can respond now.
Can the Palestinian president say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was smart of to have two Palestinian representatives now in this game, but in reality, there has to be a single Palestinian representation and single Palestinian police and single Palestinian rule, and there has to be an anti-occupation. So it's a tall order that we are talking about. But I don't assume that we will have two different Palestinian authorities at a time when there should be, as I said before, this concept would only work, in my opinion, on the day after there is a genuine peace treaty signed by leaders of both sides that are enforceable. So if that assumption means that Hamas or the Fatah or the PLO or whatever are parties in Palestine, just like you have Yamina and you have Labour Party and you have Meretz in Israel, and therefore whatever is accepted by the majority, by the PLO Executive Committee and the Palestinian National Council, and we've talked about a referendum for a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine. Once that is agreed to, then Hamas is one party, and they agree or don't agree. They cannot enforce it. They can't stop things unless they're in power. And if they're in power, then the whole game will not work. So for this game to work, it has to be a single Palestinian government that makes a decision. There's no two vetoes on the Palestinian side that I understand from this agreement. There has to be one veto, and whoever is in power, whether it's Hamas or Fatah or Marwan Barghouti, I don't care, but whoever is in charge in terms of sovereignty, power, executive power, legislative power, then they are those in charge. Will Hamas accept the concept of shared power? They have already expressed that they are not opposed to the two-state solution on the 67 borders, and therefore, would they accept it to teach tolerance when they believe that all of Palestine, historic Palestine, is Muslim? I would kind of throw back the question to you on terms of whether the Jews and this, right-wing settlers will accept to teach about Palestinian Nakba Day and all that. So these are issues that, and since there is the police and then there is investigation, if people don't want to teach it, then they'll go to jail. If that rule works, if that Confederation police force is serious, then I think either one who refuses to teach tolerance based on this law will be investigated, and if found guilty, will be punished one way or another. Maybe they'll just be fired from teaching and lose their job. I don't know.
So just to make it clear, is that your opinion that for the idea to work, the Hamas and the Palestinian Authority must merge into one entity first? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, and not only that, for that to work, because I didn't hear that there is 2 vetoes on the Palestinian side. There's only 1 veto, right? So there has to be one side represented by one individual or group that can make the veto. So you cannot have 2 vetoes, one saying no veto, one saying has to be one. But more, I think more important than that, I think there has to be an end to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza for this to work. So even regardless of Hamas and Fatah agreeing, the bigger problem is that there has to be, and this cannot replace and be again another way of turning away from dealing with the tough issues of land and expropriation and all these issues, so that we can say, yes, we can teach tolerance or not. I mean, I think that would be a waste. So this is good for the day after a genuine peace between one Palestinian party and one Israeli leadership.
I have a question that I had before. Is it the right time for me to ask a question?
Well, let's take a vote. Wait, let's take a vote. We have legislation. Let's take a vote on it.
Okay.
Palestinian parliament members, please vote. Okay, let's end the polling. Share the result. 93% of the Palestinian parliament members voted yes. Let's have the Israeli parliament members vote now. We need 55% of the Israelis to vote. And let's end the polling for the Israeli. 100% of the Israeli parliament members voted in favor of this legislation. So now let's go to the Palestinian Authority leader. Are you going to veto this legislation?
No, since it has support of the Palestinian members, I'm going to also support it.
Okay, and let's go to the Israeli Prime Minister. Are you going to veto this legislation? Israeli Prime Minister.
Yes, no, I will not veto that.
Okay, and let's go to Hamas leader. Are you going to veto this legislation?
No, I will not vote. No, I will not veto. I mean.
Okay, all right. So I think we are going to. There are a lot more legislation. Let me stop sharing so we can have a discussion. But I just want to respond to Mr. KUTTAB, who said that first there has to be an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, and first the Israeli and first Hamas and the PA have to merge. And the answer is, we are a separate government. We do not have to wait for the Israeli government and the Palestinian government to make peace. And we do not have to wait for Hamas government or Hamas and the PA. We have our own agenda. We have our own perspective, our own narrative. And we feel, I am the president, I feel that Hamas is in control of Gaza. And if I want Gaza to be included in the peace agreement, we have legislation for a common joint economic zone. And
so you have 2 vetoes on the Palestinian side.
Correct.
And will you give the Israeli opposition a veto also?
No, because we don't see, because we do not see the need to do that. We see the need to give Hamas a veto power because Hamas, if Hamas is, we are a separate government. If Hamas is not included, we believe that Hamas will be our enemy. and Gaza will be excluded. Now, if we don't give a veto power to any party in Israel, it's not going to make a difference to us because they have one government. We have our own narrative. We want to succeed to make peace for the 14 million people. We are elected by the 14 million people, and our interest is the 14 million people, not to resolve issues between Israel and the Palestinian governments. They had 73 years to do that. We have our narrative, and that's why. But we think that Hamas is in control of Gaza, and that's why we give them a veto power, because we have no choice. So, does anyone have any questions to ask? Okay, Janine, now
Yeah.
your turn.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so is there a precedent, and I'm talking about PRECED and not the president with a capital P, meaning is there an earlier event or action regarded as an example or guide to be considered in subsequent similar circumstances? And then I have one more question.
Are you asking if there is a precedent for this?
KUTTAB. I'm asking Daoud KUTTAB for his opinion about the president.
Are you asking if there is a precedent for this kind of
Yes.
arrangement? Okay, so let's have Mr. KUTTAB respond.
I'm not a historian, but I don't know that there's a precedent for this. No,
Okay,
I don't know.
One more question, very simple. This is a
Yeah.
very easy one.
Okay.
So, what would give this Israeli-Palestinian government peace? What would give this government peace?
How would
The
it make
approval of
peace?
both sides. This is for whom? For me?
Are you asking how would this government make peace?
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. That's right.
Okay. Well, I don't know if Mr. KUTTAB supported, but let's ask him.
I think if both governments, if the Palestinians and the Israelis accept it, then that will make peace. Sure, it will contribute to peace. Let's put it that way. It will make a huge contribution to peace.
Also, I wanted to say I very much appreciate you being here. I'm very grateful, even though it's 2 years, but it's so wonderful because I love your points of view and it's very easy to understand what you're saying. So congratulations and thank you.
Okay, let's go to Olivia. Olivia, do you have a question?
Well, my question is not about the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. It's just a question to Mr. KUTTAB. Am I allowed?
Yes.
Okay. Well, referring to the PA and Hamas, they're in conflict and they have been at each other's throats for many years, let's put it that way. And presumably this conflict is in the interest of Israel, so one would imagine that they nourish it. And I think really they're doing the dirty work for Israel. Well, my question is in two parts. This is the first part. I'm inclined to consider that they are Israel's henchmen. Now, am I using too strong a language? Of course, I don't wish to offend anybody, be they Palestinian or Israeli. That's my question. That's number one. The second part, they are Israel's henchmen.
Olivia, I'm not clear. Could you explain your question?
I understand the question. It's okay. I understand it.
Okay, the next part is something different. And something interesting, but at the same time, very worrying. Now, a Palestinian, I'm an old lady, by the way, I'm retired, I'm probably about the same generation as the gentleman I'm speaking to. Oh, by the way, I thank you very, very much. It's very generous of you, time-wise. Okay, I suppose about your generation. Right, way back in the 70s, when you went, if you was a Palestinian, happened to go to the UK, they thought, Palestinian, God, he's a terrorist. My God, you know. Now, that might have seemed rather odd on the part of people whose ancestors, my ancestors, played a major role in screwing you up, forgive the rude expression, but that was the way it was. They weren't taught the history. They won't talk colonial history, of course, with some exceptions, many exceptions, yes. But by and large, they didn't really know much about. Many people didn't know much about their own colonial history. Now, fast forward to nowadays, there's positive progress insofar as awareness of the plight of Palestinians on the part of the man in the street. Now, you might agree, if you know British people, that they have more or less a sense of fair play, a sense of justice. I think so. But there's a disconnect between those who govern and those who are governed. Those who govern, whether they're Labour or whether they're Conservative or God knows what, put profit before human rights. Okay? A most appalling example of that was on the 17th of November when Theresa May was entertained.
Olivia, could you focus your question, please?
I am trying to focus my question. Yes, Joseph, bear with me. It doesn't take long. Theresa May invited Mr. Netanyahu, a big party, to celebrate Balfour. Well, that was a smack in the face, a lot worse than a smack in the face for Palestinians, for you, for yourself. Okay, now let's get on to the other problem. Not just the politicians who think of profit and arm, not just that. Let's consider another problem called the Jewish lobby. Now, the more you discover and research and read about the Jewish lobby in the UK, in France, in the US, it sends shivers up your spine, okay? Now, my question, it's almost rhetorical, but I'll make it a question. It's very difficult for you as a journalist. Also, the language that's been used nowadays has been used. Hang on, I've just written down one. Take down a building, that means blow up a building. Take out, that means murder. I won't go on
Olivia,
because there are other people who want to. My question is, it must be very difficult for you, for people, your colleagues in Europe, whom I'm sure you know, to pro-Palestinian colleagues, even Jewish ones like Silva Sipel, intellectuals, to be a journalist nowadays. Okay, do you agree? So, since it has to be a question, it's rhetorical, but okay, I finished. Thank you, Mr. KUTTAB.
I love my job and I love being a journalist. So it is challenging, I would definitely say, but let me take you back to the first question, because I think it's very important for people to understand what happened in 2006 when we had free and fair elections, and which Ismail Haniyeh, the head of a movement called the List for Reform and Justice or something like that, won the majority of votes, and he was appointed prime minister. What happened? The entire world, including the US and the UK, removed the signature of the Minister of Finance of Palestine from any banking operation. And as a result, 5 million Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, the finance minister could not sign a check, could not move money. And that created a huge problem until today. Even as we speak, when Israel wants money to go to Gaza, and Qatar is willing to give the money, they literally take it in a bag, in a suitcase, with $100 bill, because the Israelis and the Americans who support them refuse to recognize Hamas. Well, they recognize Taliban and they negotiate with Taliban, they negotiate with the Lebanese, which has Hezbollah, they negotiate with everybody else. But for some reason, my friend, the representative of Hamas, is not allowed to sign a check because they are Hamas. I'm not a supporter of Hamas, but the entire idea of running a government, if your finance minister is not allowed to open a bank account or transfer money, is disaster. So that is not to blame only the international community, but a large part of it, including Israel, has to be blamed. And the Israelis, when they put the boycott on Gaza, they said, we don't want to starve them to death, but we want them to have a diet. So we cut off some of the food into Gaza. We don't want them to die, but we want them to lose some weight. I mean, come on. I mean, inhuman way of dealing with Palestinians. So your second question about the 70s and how Palestinians were treated. And you alluded to the Balfour, and it was from Balfour's days that the British colonial rulers decided to give money to one group and not to another, and to give the land and to make promises of Palestinian land to the Jews. And we're suffering from that. But, you know, you said the right things, that there is a change of awareness and there's strong lobby. But still, the UK has not recognized the state of Palestine. They say day and night, we support two-state solution, but they have not supported Palestine. And today, there is a joint Israeli, German, India, UK flight exercise called the Blue Flight Exercise. And the Israelis are proud that the flight exercise flew over Jerusalem, as if to say, you know, this is a way to kind of remind everybody in the world that Israel has control and sovereignty over Jerusalem, even though the world doesn't recognize their occupation of East Jerusalem. So we have a problem, you're right, with the governments and not with the people, but still we need to find a way to bridge that gap. Sorry.
Mr. KUTTAB, since you mentioned Gaza, I couldn't help myself. And I want to show you what a common government could do with respect to Gaza. So we have a legislation for a joint economic zone between Israel and Gaza that would exclusively run by the common government. That it will have a common economy, including the banking that you just mentioned, common education, industry, agriculture, sewer treatment, desalination plants, solar farms, and power and green energy, international airport and seaport, equally accessible to Israeli and Palestinians. So I'd like to take a vote on that. Let's have the Palestinian parliament members please vote on that legislation. Okay, and let's share the result. And let's stop sharing and have the Israeli parliament members vote on this legislation. Let's end the polling, share the results. 80% of the Israeli parliament members. Let's go to Hamas leader. Mr. Hamas leader, are you going to veto this legislation?
No, I will not. Thank you.
And let's go to the PA leader. Are you going to veto this legislation?
No, I accept this legislation.
And let's go to the Israeli Prime Minister. Are you going to veto this legislation?
Not only will I not veto that, I strongly support it.
Okay. So this is another demonstration of what a common government, because we seem to be speaking exclusively about the Israeli requirements or the Palestinian Hamas and the PA requirement, but we are representing the people. We have our own requirements. We are a third entity, and we can have our own imagination and our own narrative. So, Mr. KUTTAB, how would you respond to this kind of legislation?
Well, it's very good. I mean, it's we have not been able to get the Gaza West Bank pathway open since the Oslo Accords approved it. It was open for a few days in 1999 before everything, you know, went bad. So yes, I would support any effort that allows Palestinians to have access to airports, and access between Gaza and the West Bank needs to be ensured. But yes, this sounds like a good idea. I don't know how you're going to have an airport in an economic zone. Usually economic zones are quite small, but the concept, sure, sounds very good. I have no problem.
Giacomo, did you have a question?
No.
Okay, let's go to Nasir.
Yes, yeah, I do have a question. Mr. DAOUD, first of all, thank you for coming and thank you for your work. I'm also Palestinian from Jerusalem and living in the US. My question to you is, well, last week we had Cornel West, and Cornel West said something very interesting, that a lot of what's happening, and especially like here, is we focus a lot on what he called utopia, and he said, which is good, because utopia, you know, we want the best for the future. But at the same time, we don't want too much utopia where we don't deal with the substance. And what, like Joseph just said, that there about this measure, which brings economic help to Palestinians, and as well as to Israel. But the problem I feel, and maybe you can answer this question, is how do we make Israelis know that, like, for Palestinians, the time is like, we feel like we're losing our land. The carpet beneath our feet is being pulled. Israel can sit for another 50 years, not worry about their cities shrinking, worried about access to their country, getting in and out of the border. But Palestinians, we're like being choked. Our lands, our cities are shrinking, our housing is shrinking, our territory is shrinking. And these are issues that need to be addressed now. And I feel like waiting 5 to 10 more years is literally, we're going to disappear almost, especially like people in Jerusalem.
Well, this is the problem of colonial problems. This is a colonial issue, the only one of the few, if not the only colonial power that is controlling lives of people who are not their own. And they have absolute power, military power to control the people, and to also not only to control, but to suck the money out of this country economically, bring its own people and use the fertile land for it. So we have a problem, and the concept that we're talking about here is a concept that it makes sense if we can find a way to end occupation. It makes sense to find a third party here. I mean, here we have an Israeli-Palestinian third party, which, good luck. I hope we can work, but certainly we need a third party to educate to basically, separate between the settlers and the Palestinians, the Hamas, the Muslim worshippers, and the invading Jews who think this mosque is the Temple Mount and they want to blow up the mosque. We have all kinds of problems all over that needs to be addressed, and it cannot be addressed by the Israelis. They cannot be addressed by the Israeli government and the Israeli military, who is subservient to the Israeli Minister of Defense, who's subservient to the Prime Minister, who is elected by half the population. So we have a problem that has to be resolved, and we need a third party. If the IPC can be that third party, it can work. Ahlan wa sahlan, welcome.
Thank you. Do you see the possibility of having a secular common government in the Middle East, because both sides are so attached to religion?
No, look, the PLO and its covenant actually calls for a secular democratic state. You look up the PLO's covenant. Unfortunately, the PLO did a bad job in selling its own position, and the Israeli propagandists turned the PLO covenant into an anti-Israeli, paper. And so the PLO had to kind of come down and say, okay, we accept the two-state solution and so on. But the idea of a secular, that's one of the main differences between the PLO and Hamas is the PLO has Christians and has a Jew, it has members of all the religions, and many people who are not religious at all. So the PLO in its constitution and its ideology is secular. Hamas is not, but even Hamas is moving a little bit towards the middle grounds. So yes, I think I think we need to religionize, I don't know what the word is, to make it less religious, because it's what is causing all our problems is the religion, and the problems of religion is that it's absolute. If you believe in whatever you believe in, then you think this is the right thing. You're willing to die for what you believe in. You are so attached to your belief, which I respect. But you cannot let your belief be the kind of the rule or the ideology of the country. And so Israelis initially, I think, wanted to have less religious, and slowly they used religion for their own purposes, and then slowly Israelis moved more and more towards a more religious state, and nobody was allowed to get in and Al-Aqsa Mosque after 1967. Now they're allowed to go in, and now the Israeli government is sanctioning and even talking about allowing them to pray in a place that has been run and controlled by Muslims for 14 centuries, except for 100 years when the Crusaders came. So, their religion is a huge problem. And if you can find a way to get people to deal with a secular government, ahlan wa sahlan, you're most welcome.
Okay, so as a matter of fact, we do have a proposition on that. Let me share my screen.
While you're doing this, Joseph and Mr. Kuttab, just a small interjection. If you mention number of centuries, the Jewish people have had the control of this area 35 centuries ago, not 40.
So, okay.
So
they didn't have control over the mosque area for 35 centuries. It didn't
yes,
exist.
yes, we did.
Since it existed, the Muslims have had it.
No,
but
we
yeah,
don't.
if we're going to let God in the Old Testament be the ruler, then we will not get anywhere. So I don't think it's a good idea.
That's right. But since you mentioned number of centuries, I had to interject that. But we want to move on. We don't need to go back. We want to move on to see where can we go from here.
Okay, so here we have legislation. This is not really it's a declaration. We are a separate government, and we are voting on a declaration of peace. Our goal is to be a shining example for peace and tolerance. Remember, we are a third government. We believe in the respect for all people, regardless of religion or gender. We are committed to protect all people of all religions and to value the sanctity of life. All people are equal. All religions are equal. The practice of religion is voluntary and shall not be imposed. The land belongs to no religion, and no war shall be imposed on the count of religion. We encourage all governments of the world to adopt this resolution. Now, we are elected by 5 million people. Remember our assumptions. So does anyone have any question regarding this declaration of peace? And then we're going to vote on it.
Didn't we change, because when it says the land belongs to no religion, and we said that certain places within the Holy Land do actually belong, like the recognized religious sites of that religion, like, you know, Bethlehem, Al-Aqsa, the Kotel. I thought we changed that.
No, we have an amended one, a softer one, but I'm trying to pass this one first, and if it doesn't work, we'll go to the amended one.
Okay.
This is the less universal one. I would like to pass the more universal one that says that religion does not own the land. And but if you are vetoing, then we'll go to the next one.
Yeah, because I have to veto it as Palestinian president, because I cannot accept anything that doesn't give Islam, or religion of our majority of our people, the right to our holy space, Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Okay, so you're telling me ahead of time, I'm going to veto it. Joseph, don't bring it up. Okay, so I'm bringing this one, the amended Declaration of Peace. And it's the same thing, but it says here, we respect the connections of all religions to the land, and no war shall be imposed on the count of religion. This is the only difference between the first one and the second one. So we're saying we respect all religions to the land. Do you have a problem with that, Mr. President?
No, this one is acceptable to me.
Okay, so let's take a vote on that. Let's have the Palestinian parliament members vote. Okay, let's end the polling. Let's share the results. 93% of the Palestinian parliament members voted in favor of this declaration. Let's have the Israeli parliament members vote. Let's end the polling, share the results. 100% of the Israeli parliament members voted. Okay, here we don't have a veto power, but let me ask the Hamas leader, are you going to accept this declaration? Mr. Hamas leader.
Yes, the amended one is fine with me.
Okay, and what about the Israeli Prime Minister?
I will accept it.
Okay, so we have a compromise here. All three governments agree to it, and the Confederation agrees to it. And let's go back to Mr. KUTTAB.
Well, I mean, I think it's a nice concept of bypassing the difficulties, and I do think that you put your fingers on the problem of religion, because it is a problem. It's what's driving people nuts here. That people think that God gave this land to them 3,000 years ago, and they don't care about the local landowners. They don't mean anything to them. This is God-given land to them. And, for the same reason, Hamas has refused to accept and recognize Israel, because they say all of Palestine, historic Palestine, is Muslim, and we cannot make a compromise on that. So I think we need to find ways to get religion out of the negotiations. If we can, I think it will do everybody a favor.
Okay. So let me make any other questions before we go to
And maybe I can suggest something that may be a wording that you can use now or in the future, which is the word status quo. Okay, it's a very often used word, but people sometimes misuse it. But the idea is, it is what it is. I mean, Holy Sepulchre, there's understanding. There's Al-Aqsa Mosque, there's understanding, different places. So without dealing with who has the right and who has God-given right, things are as they are, and I think we should accept that. So I would like to kind of impress on you or the legislatures to introduce the concept of status quo, that we accept status quo as it has existed for hundreds of years or something to that effect.
But if we say that, then wouldn't the settlers say, we are here, status quo, we will not be removed?
It's fine. I don't care about the settlers. I care more about the religious sites. That's what I'm talking about. I'm saying about Jerusalem religious sites.
Okay,
yeah.
So we are accepting the status quo on the religious aspect. And
yes.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let me just go to Mr. KUTTAB. Do you have any concluding remarks?
No, actually, I'm pleasantly surprised, to be honest with you. I didn't expect the deep thought that you have put into it. I mean, my understanding of the concept of the Confederation has always been in an agreement between two states, and I think I support a confederation of any kind, so long as we have it into occupation and colonialism. So if there is no colonial rule and there is a Palestinian state, and yet still, even with the Palestinian state, or before that, as you're suggesting, we can find a way to create a body that can at least discuss issues that deal with the day-to-day things. I've often, last week I met a U.S. official here in Amman, and I said, my dream is for ex-generals of Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and the US or NATO could create some kind of an NGO that can answer the simple question of what is really security, because the Israelis use the word security for everything that they have this Palestinian humanitarian guy in jail for 5 years. They can't allow people to talk about the reason because of security. We can't cross a bridge at certain times because of security. We can't do this because of security. So I would like ex-generals who actually can know what security is all about, be the ones to actually answer that question. Because if you allow the Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence service, to decide what is security, then we're in big trouble. We need to find a third party that everybody trusts, that actually has some generals, some ex-generals who actually know about security, to make decisions that what is security. But for only one side, and for representatives of one side to decide what is security and to make life miserable for the other side because of their concept of security. I mean, that's where we are. You know, the other day, Naftali Bennett said, if there is a Palestinian state, it will be 7 minutes from my house. Well, Israel is, you know, all over our houses for the last 70 years. So, you know, all of a sudden he's worried about being 7 minutes away from a Palestinian state, but he doesn't understand that they have been occupying and living and taking our lands and so on for tens of years. So yes, we need to have a party, not the Israeli army, to actually decide what is security and what is not, and to find solutions that can give people integrity and a good life without being bound by the Israeli interpretation of security. If you can find answer to that question, I think a lot of the problems that we're talking about, you know, we've not had family reunion for 20 years because of security, you know. Come on. And my daughter is married to a man from Bethlehem. She's from Jerusalem. He cannot sleep overnight in her house in Jerusalem because of security. Come on. So this issue, it drives me crazy. And the word security is abused all the time. And we need, maybe the IPC should put, you know, put out a call for ex-generals from the US, NATO, Israel, and Jordan, and Palestine to create a security council that actually can decide what really is security and what is not. And if you can deal with that particular word and give really honest answers to what is genuine security and what is bullshit, what is you know, a lie, then you can have people have a good life or normal life.
Now, wouldn't it be much easier and much more truthful and honest to have a common government decide that issue that you just raised of what is?
Yes, but governments and parliaments are all going to be singing to the, that's why I want ex-generals, not existing generals, because generals working in the government, they abide by their leaders. Politicians will pay whoever, you know, will vote for whatever they want. I want, okay, it could be part of the IPC. You could have maybe a committee of ex-generals from outside of the region or from within the region, but people who are not bound by the decisions of the defense minister of either country, a genuine security expert who can actually decide with his colleagues from from the Arab and from NATO or whatever, does Israel really need to have the Jordan Valley for security in the day where you have all these missiles around the world? It doesn't really make sense that we destroy the chance of peace between us because a few generals in the 40s and 50s talked about the Alon plan, and they still believe in the Alon plan when it doesn't really need to be done anymore. That's the problem, that security has overridden everything else, and security not from a scientific point of view, security from the point of view of the Shin Bet and the Israeli army, and now from the right-wing people in Israel.
Mr. KUTTAB, I'm curious. Do you live in Jerusalem now?
Yes, yes, I do.
In the
Kufr Aqab is my house.
Which
You
one?
want to come and visit me? Kufr Aqab. It's actually a no man's zone beyond the wall, but it's part of Jerusalem, and so it's a very crazy area.
So do you think myself as an Israeli can walk over to that territory without being concerned to my safety or anything like that?
Actually, where I live is part of the what you call the state of Israel. It's under Israeli security control now. Because it's beyond the wall, it's not safe. But some of my Israeli friends have come and have had no problems. The problem of coming is whether you are a guest of somebody or whether you're coming without being a guest. If you're my guest, you're safe. If you come without, being invited, then you're a settler.
I may take you up on it.
Ahlan wa sahlan.
Ahlan wa sahlan.
All right, let me make a closing remark. First of all, I'd like to thank DAOUD KUTTAB for his generosity and for his time and for his willingness to play along with what we are doing here and your imagination. I want to thank you so much for participating we will think about it further. Hopefully you'll think about it further. We have thought about it. We think it is possible to create a common government. We think that now we have the era of the internet. We can hold the election online, very easy. The country of Estonia does that. 9.5 million people. We think it's possible to have a common government. We will need grassroots support, grassroots financial support. So you can go and donate to our website, ipconfederation.org. We will need to educate people and potential parliament members on both sides, Palestinian and Israelis, and we need to recruit them. And I'm asking you to share this vision on social media, to tell your friends to join our next simulations, and to continue with the future simulation, and also to contact the media and tell them that there is another possible way to solve this issue. So I want to thank you all for joining, and I want to thank again Mr. KUTTAB for his generosity and his time.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, everyone.